On the morning of August 14th, 1883, in the rural village of Thornfield, Hampshire, England, something was discovered that would challenge every assumption about the nature of human consciousness, the linearity of time, and the boundaries between impossible precognition and documented reality. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, a schoolteacher of 26 years, with a reputation for methodical observation and unwavering dedication to her students' development, arrived at the small village schoolhouse that morning to find 8-year-old Catherine Ashworth already seated at her desk, surrounded by papers covered in drawings that would later be described by architectural experts as technically impossible for any child, let alone one from a farming family in rural Hampshire with no exposure to professional draftsmanship or architectural training of any kind. The drawings had been accumulating quietly over the previous weeks, tucked into Catherine's schoolbooks and hidden beneath her slate. But on this particular morning, Miss Hartwell discovered them scattered across the child's workspace with such profusion that she could no longer overlook what she had previously dismissed as ordinary childhood sketching. What she saw would be documented in her diary, now preserved in the Hampshire County Archives, as the moment when ordinary childhood artistic expression revealed itself to be something profoundly and disturbingly extraordinary. The drawing that first arrested Miss Hartwell's attention depicted a Gothic building of considerable scale and architectural complexity, rendered with a precision that suggested professional training and years of technical experience. The structure rose across the page in perfect perspective, showing a facade of ornate stonework, pointed arches characteristic of Gothic Revival architecture, and a level of structural detail that included buttresses, fenestration patterns, and decorative elements executed with mathematical accuracy. But what truly distinguished this drawing from the work of even the most talented child was the presence of annotations written in tiny, precise script along the margins, technical terminology that included load-bearing calculations, measurements in feet and inches, specifications for stone types and mortar composition, and architectural terms that Miss Hartwell, despite her education, barely recognized, and certainly could not imagine an 8-year-old farm child having encountered, let alone mastered. The schoolteacher's initial response, documented in her diary entry dated August 14th, 1883, moved from admiration to confusion, to a creeping unease as she examined drawing after drawing, each showing the same impossible combination of childish handwriting and professional architectural draftsmanship, innocent subject matter rendered with technical sophistication that seemed to emanate from two entirely different minds occupying the same small hand. Catherine herself, when questioned that morning, offered no explanation that satisfied Miss Hartwell's growing concern, stating only that she enjoyed drawing buildings and that the pictures came to her easily, a response that seemed entirely inadequate given the evidence spread across the schoolroom desk. The child's family, the Ashworths, were tenant farmers of modest means, hard-working people with no connection to architecture, engineering, or any profession that might explain their daughter's sudden manifestation of technical ability that would, in the months to come, prove to be not merely precocious, but genuinely impossible, suggesting knowledge of buildings and urban planning that existed nowhere in the world of 1883, and perhaps, most disturbingly, nowhere in the world at all. But before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. On August 20th, 1883, exactly 6 days after the initial discovery, Miss Eleanor Hartwell carried a selection of Catherine Ashworth's most technically sophisticated drawings to the modest office of Thomas Pemberton, the only qualified architect within 20 miles of Thornfield, a man of 43 years who had trained at the Architectural Association in London and maintained a small but respectable practice designing country houses, church renovations, and occasional municipal buildings for the surrounding Hampshire townships. Pemberton's initial reaction, documented in his professional correspondence, now preserved in the Royal Institute of British Architects' Archives, was one of polite dismissal tinged with mild amusement at what he assumed was a schoolteacher's overestimation of a student's abilities, a common enough occurrence that he had encountered before when proud parents or enthusiastic educators brought him drawings they believed demonstrated exceptional talent, but which typically revealed nothing more than ordinary childhood artistic development, with perhaps slightly better proportion sense than average. His condescending smile, which Miss Hartwell later described in her diary as infuriating in its patronizing assumption of her ignorance, faded within 30 seconds of his actually examining the first drawing she placed before him on his drafting table, a large sheet showing the Gothic building that had initially caught her attention. Rendered in what he immediately recognized as professional elevation view, with accompanying cross-sectional details that no amateur, let alone a child, should have been capable of producing. The transformation in Pemberton's demeanour, according to Miss Hartwell's account, was both immediate and unsettling, his expression shifting from amused tolerance to genuine confusion, then to something approaching alarm as he examined drawing after drawing with increasingly agitated movements, muttering technical terms under his breath, and occasionally pausing to measure proportions with his drafting tools, comparing the child's work against his own professional standards, and finding, to his visible disturbance, that Catherine's drawings demonstrated not merely competent draftsmanship, but mastery of architectural principles, including proper load distribution, structural support systems, and the complex mathematics of Gothic arch construction that required years of training to execute correctly. What disturbed Pemberton most profoundly, as he stated in his written assessment dated August 20th, 1883, was not simply the technical proficiency, but the specific architectural vocabulary evident in the margin notations, terminology that included references to flying buttresses with calculated thrust coefficients, fenestration patterns optimized for both aesthetic and structural integrity, and foundation specifications that suggested understanding of soil load-bearing capacity and settlement prevention. Concepts that he himself had struggled to master during his apprenticeship and which he could not imagine any 8-year-old comprehending, let alone applying with the mathematical precision evident in these drawings. His assessment, written with what reads as barely controlled professional anxiety, noted that the architectural style was clearly Victorian neo-Gothic, but executed with a purity of form and structural sophistication that suggested either direct copying from professional architectural plans, which Miss Hartwell assured him was impossible given Catherine's limited access to any such materials, or alternatively, and far more disturbingly, the child possessed knowledge that simply could not exist in her mind through any rational means of acquisition. When Pemberton insisted on meeting Catherine herself, the encounter, documented by both his professional notes and Miss Hartwell's diary, only deepened the mystery rather than resolving it, as the child proved entirely unable to explain her technical knowledge, responding to his increasingly frustrated questions with simple, almost vacant answers that she enjoyed drawing buildings, that the pictures came to her at night when she was lying in bed, and that she simply drew what she saw in her mind without understanding the words she wrote in the margins, or why the buildings needed to be drawn exactly as they appeared to her. Pemberton's final written statement, preserved in the archives alongside the drawings he briefly retained for study, concluded with the professionally damaging admission that he could offer no rational explanation for Catherine Ashworth's abilities, that the work demonstrated knowledge impossible for her age and circumstances, and that he found himself confronting something that challenged his understanding of how architectural skill could be acquired, transmitted, or manifested in a human mind that should have contained none of the necessary education, experience, or exposure to produce what he was examining. On September 3rd, 1883, precisely 2 weeks after Thomas Pemberton's disturbing assessment had left the case of Catherine Ashworth's impossible drawings without rational explanation, Dr. James Hartford arrived in Thornfield with the methodical determination of a man trained in both medical science and the emerging field of psychological phenomena, his credentials including a degree from Guy's Hospital in London, membership in the Society for Psychical Research founded just the previous year, and a published reputation for investigating cases of alleged mental aberration with rigorous skepticism that had, until this point, invariably revealed naturalistic explanations for seemingly supernatural manifestations. Hartford's case notes, now preserved in the British Medical Journal archives, document his initial impression of Catherine as a slight child of unremarkable appearance, pale complexion consistent with rural living and limited sunlight exposure, demonstrating no obvious signs of neurological disorder, mental deficiency, or the theatrical effect common to cases of fraudulent manifestation. An assessment that reflected his expectation of finding either deliberate deception or some previously undiagnosed medical condition that might account for the architectural knowledge she appeared to possess. His methodology, established during his first visit and documented with the precise detail characteristic of his medical training, involved controlled observation sessions conducted in the schoolhouse under conditions designed to eliminate the possibility of coaching, copying, or any form of external assistance that might explain the technical sophistication of her drawings. On September 5, 1883, Hartford conducted the first supervised drawing session, providing Catherine with fresh paper, pencils of varying hardness, and a ruler, materials she accepted with the calm demeanor of a child performing an ordinary task, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty one might expect from someone about to attempt work far beyond their supposed capabilities. What Hartford witnessed over the following 2 hours, documented in case notes written with what reads as barely suppressed agitation, despite his professional training in objective observation, would establish the authenticity of Catherine's abilities beyond any reasonable doubt, and simultaneously deepen the mystery into something that challenged the very foundations of his understanding of human consciousness and the acquisition of knowledge. The child began drawing without preliminary sketching or apparent planning, her hand moving across the paper with what Hartford described as mechanical precision utterly unlike the tentative, exploratory movements characteristic of artistic creation, producing first a detailed street layout showing intersecting thoroughfares with precise width measurements, then individual building facades with architectural elements rendered in perfect perspective, then interior floor plans showing room divisions, doorway placements, staircase configurations, and even furniture arrangements sketched with symbolic representations that Hartford recognized as standard architectural convention, but which Catherine herself, when questioned during brief pauses, could not explain or name. The most disturbing aspect of the session, according to Hartford's medical observations, was Catherine's progressive dissociation from her surroundings as the drawing continued, her responses to questions becoming delayed and mechanical, her gaze fixed on the paper with an intensity that seemed to exclude all peripheral awareness, and most significantly, the complete transformation in her physical bearing from the fidgeting restlessness typical of an 8-year-old required to sit still into an absolute stillness, broken only by the movement of her drawing hand, a state Hartford recognized from his neurological training as resembling certain trance conditions he had observed in patients under hypnotic influence or experiencing epileptic automatism, though Catherine showed none of the other physiological markers associated with either condition. Throughout September and October of 1883, Dr. Bewan, James Hartford maintained meticulous documentation of what became an increasingly disturbing accumulation of drawings that transformed his initial case study of an unusual child into an investigation of a phenomenon that defied every framework of rational explanation he possessed, his catalogue expanding from the dozen drawings that had first brought Catherine Ashworth to his attention into a systematically organized collection that would eventually number over 200 individual pieces, each one assigned a sequential identification number, dated according to its creation, and accompanied by detailed notes describing the circumstances of its production and the specific architectural or urban planning elements it contained. The scope of Catherine's output during these 8 weeks was itself remarkable. Averaging nearly 4 drawings per day, including those produced during the supervised sessions Hartford conducted twice weekly, and those created during what her parents described as nocturnal episodes of compulsive drawing that left the child exhausted each morning. But what distinguished this expanding portfolio from mere prolific production was the progressive revelation of an underlying coherence that suggested Catherine was not creating random architectural fantasies, but rather documenting a complete urban environment with the systematic thoroughness of a professional surveyor mapping an existing city. The drawings evolved from the individual building studies that had characterized her early work into increasingly complex compositions showing entire streetscapes with multiple structures. Detailed city blocks revealing the relationships between adjacent buildings and the infrastructure connecting them, and comprehensive urban planning layouts that indicated sophisticated understanding of how residential districts, commercial zones, industrial areas, and public spaces should be organized to create a functioning metropolitan environment. Hartford's catalogue notes, preserved in the British Medical Journal archives, document his growing recognition of recurring elements that appeared across multiple drawings, with a consistency that ruled out random invention or childish improvisation, most notably a distinctive clock tower of unusual design featuring 4 faces and a spire topped with what appeared to be an astronomical device, rendered from at least 7 different perspectives and distances that allowed Hartford to triangulate its probable location within the broader urban landscape Catherine was depicting. The circular public garden appeared in 12 separate drawings, each one revealing additional details about its layout, including a central fountain with specific sculptural elements, radiating pathways dividing the space into geometric sections, surrounding benches of particular design, and perimeter plantings that Catherine indicated with small notations suggesting specific species of trees and ornamental shrubs, all rendered with the attention to horticultural detail that suggested either direct observation or access to professional landscape architecture plans. The railway station featured prominently in 9 drawings showing exterior facades, interior concourse layouts, platform configurations, and track arrangements demonstrated technical understanding of railway engineering, including platform heights calculated for specific carriage designs, track gauge specifications, and structural elements necessary to support the broad-span roof that Catherine depicted with precise notation of supporting girders and their load-bearing calculations. What concerned Hartford most profoundly, documented in his increasingly anxious case notes as October progressed, was not merely the technical sophistication of the individual drawings, but their cumulative suggestion of a complete, internally consistent urban environment that no 8-year-old child, regardless of prodigious talent or unexplained knowledge, should have been capable of conceiving in its entirety, and the disturbing realization that Catherine appeared to be not creating this city through imaginative invention, but rather discovering it through some mechanism of perception that allowed her to see and transcribe a place that existed somewhere, somehow, beyond the ordinary boundaries of space and immediate observation. The adults gathered around this expanding collection, Miss Hartwell, Thomas Pemberton during his occasional visits, and Hartford himself, found themselves confronting not the charming precocity of a talented child, but something far more unsettling, a window into an impossible vista that should not have been accessible to human consciousness yet, was being rendered with undeniable precision by a girl who could not explain what she was drawing or why the compulsion to draw it had seized her with such consuming intensity. William and Margaret Ashworth, Catherine's parents, were people of modest circumstances whose lives until the autumn of 1883 had followed the unremarkable pattern of rural agricultural labor. William, managing a small tenant farm of 43 acres, where he raised sheep and cultivated barley with the steady competence of a man following the occupation of 3 generations of Ashworths before him, while Margaret maintained their stone cottage, raised their 4 children, of whom Catherine was the youngest, and supplemented the family income through skilled needlework she sold at the monthly market in Winchester, neither parent possessing education beyond basic literacy or any background in art, architecture, or the cultural refinements of urban professional classes. Facts documented in the 1881 census records that describe them as farmer and farmer's wife, with no indication of the extraordinary circumstances that would soon transform their youngest child into a subject of medical and academic investigation. Their initial response to Catherine's drawings, according to Margaret's letters to her sister Elizabeth, preserved in the private collection of the Ashworth family descendants, had been one of genuine pride mixed with bemused confusion about where such talent might have originated. Margaret, writing on August 19, 1883, that "Our Catherine has produced the most remarkable pictures that have impressed even the schoolmistress, though I confess I cannot understand how she has learned such things, for neither William nor I can draw more than the simplest figures, and we have never taken her to see grand buildings or given her instruction beyond what Miss Hartwell provides at the village school." This pride, however, began transforming into mounting concern throughout September and October, as Catherine's compulsive drawing intensified beyond the boundaries of normal childhood enthusiasm into something that increasingly dominated her existence and visibly diminished her physical and mental well-being, a deterioration that Margaret documented with the worried precision of a mother watching her child slip away into something she could neither understand nor prevent. The nocturnal episodes became the family's most immediate source of distress, Catherine waking sometimes 3 or 4 times per week in the deep hours after midnight, rising from the bed she shared with her older sister Anne, and moving with what her mother described as the purposeful walk of someone fully awake yet somehow absent from herself, to whatever drawing materials were available, where she would work by candlelight for hours, sometimes until dawn broke over the Hampshire countryside, producing her impossible architectural renderings with mechanical precision, while remaining utterly unresponsive to her parents' questions or attempts to guide her back to bed. And upon finally ceasing her work and returning to sleep, she would wake in the morning with no memory of the nocturnal session and visible exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to alleviate. The physical toll became undeniable as October progressed, Catherine losing weight despite her mother's efforts to encourage eating, developing dark circles under her eyes that gave her pale face a haunted quality, disturbing in one so young, and most alarmingly, displaying an increasing detachment during her waking hours, participating in family activities and conversations with a mechanical quality, suggesting her mind remained elsewhere, focused on something invisible to those around her, but utterly consuming to her own consciousness. Margaret's letter to her sister, dated October 27, 1883, conveys the desperate confusion of a mother confronting something beyond her comprehension, writing that Catherine is slipping away into another world entirely. She sits at table and eats what is placed before her, but without seeming to taste it. She responds when spoken to, but as if from a great distance. And her eyes have taken on a quality I can only describe as looking through us rather than at us, as though we have become less real to her than whatever visions occupy her mind during those dreadful drawing sessions that exhaust her body, but seem to feed something else within her that grows stronger as she herself grows weaker. The family's desperate attempts to stop the behavior, documented in Dr. Hartford's case notes from his interviews with the parents, escalated from gentle discouragement to active intervention, including the removal of all drawing materials from the house, the locking of Catherine's bedroom door at night, and constant vigilance by Margaret, who attempted to sleep in shifts with her oldest daughter to prevent the nocturnal episodes. Yet these measures proved not merely ineffective, but revealed the truly disturbing depth of Catherine's compulsion, when, on the morning of November 2, 1883, Margaret discovered her daughter kneeling on the wooden floor of the locked bedroom, her fingernails bloodied from scratching architectural designs directly into the floorboards with such force that she had created visible grooves in the wood, designs that, when later examined by Professor Blackwood, proved to be accurate scaled representations of building facades, rendered with the same impossible precision as her pencil drawings, despite being scratched into solid oak by the fingernails of an 8-year-old child who appeared utterly unaware of the physical damage she had inflicted upon herself in service to the compulsion that had seized her. Professor Edmund Blackwood arrived in Thornfield on the cold morning of November 8, 1883, summoned by an urgent telegram from Dr. James Hartford, whose message had been characteristically brief, yet sufficiently intriguing to compel the journey from Cambridge, the telegram reading simply, "Child producing architectural drawings of impossible sophistication. Medical phenomenon requires expert architectural analysis. Your immediate attendance requested." A communication that Blackwood had initially considered dismissing as the over-enthusiastic interpretation of provincial observers unfamiliar with genuine architectural talent, until a follow-up letter arrived containing 3 photographic reproductions of Catherine's drawings that transformed his skeptical curiosity into genuine scholarly interest that demanded personal investigation. Blackwood's credentials in architectural history were impeccable, documented in the Cambridge University records, showing his appointment as reader in architectural studies in 1877, his published monograph on Gothic Revival architecture earning him recognition from the Royal Institute of British Architects, and his particular expertise in structural engineering principles, making him uniquely qualified to assess the technical validity of Catherine's work beyond mere aesthetic evaluation. His initial examination of the drawings collection that Hartford had systematically assembled was conducted with the detached analytical approach of an academic evaluating historical documents, Blackwood spending the entire afternoon of November 8th in Hartford's study, where the drawings had been organized chronologically across 2 large tables, his process methodical and documented in the leather-bound notebook he maintained throughout the investigation, now preserved in Cambridge University's special collections, recording his observations about architectural styles, construction methods, structural calculations, and urban planning principles visible in the work of a child who should have possessed no knowledge whatsoever of such sophisticated concepts. What began as academic interest in an unusual case study transformed over those hours into something approaching intellectual disturbance, as Blackwood's trained eye recognized not the fantastical imaginings of childhood creativity, but practical, buildable structures following engineering principles that demonstrated advanced understanding of load-bearing calculations, stress distribution, foundation requirements for different soil conditions, and structural solutions to architectural challenges that suggested knowledge not merely beyond an 8-year-old child, but in some cases beyond the standardized practices of 1883 professional architecture. His particular focus, documented extensively in his notebook entries from November 8th through November 12th, concentrated on structural elements that revealed the most disturbing anachronisms. Catherine's drawings, showing buildings incorporating what appeared to be steel framework construction methods that would not become widespread until the 1890s. Foundation designs suggesting understanding of deep caisson technology still experimental in 1883, and most unsettling of all, utility planning that indicated provision for electrical lighting systems and internal water distribution networks following principles that would not be standardized in British construction until well into the 20th century. Blackwood's correspondence with his Cambridge colleagues, preserved in the university archives, documents his increasingly disturbed state of mind as the implications of what he was examining became undeniable. His letter dated November the 10th, 1883, to Professor Charles Ashford, stating with barely contained agitation that "I am confronted with architectural drawings that demonstrate technical knowledge that should not exist in 1883, much less emanate from an uneducated child in rural Hampshire. The structural calculations alone would challenge a qualified engineer." Yet they appear to flow from this girl's pencil with the ease of someone copying from direct observation rather than creating through imagination, and I confess I can find no rational framework to explain what I am witnessing. What disturbed Blackwood most profoundly, and what would consume his attention for the remaining decades of his life, was not that the drawings were technically sophisticated, but that they were technically correct, demonstrating not artistic fantasy, but engineering reality that suggested Catherine was not inventing impossible structures, but rather transcribing genuine architectural information from a source that should not have been accessible to her, or indeed to anyone, in the autumn of 1883. The breakthrough occurred on November 15, 1883, precisely 1 week after Professor Blackwood's arrival in Thornfield, when he made the methodical decision to reorganize Catherine's entire collection of drawings according to a system that would reveal what he later described in his journal as the most disturbing pattern I have encountered in 3 decades of architectural scholarship. A reorganization that began with his careful examination of each drawing for subtle directional indicators, sight lines between buildings, street orientations relative to compass directions that Catherine had occasionally marked in tiny notations at the margins, and the progressive realization that these individual architectural renderings were not isolated structures, but interconnected elements of a unified urban landscape that could be assembled like pieces of an elaborate cartographic puzzle spanning what his calculations would eventually determine to be approximately 3 square miles of meticulously planned city development. Blackwood commandeered the entire dining room of the Hartford residence for this endeavor, documented in Hartford's personal correspondence, describing how the professor worked for 11 consecutive hours on November 15th, arranging and rearranging the drawings on the large table, and eventually expanding to the floor when the table surface proved insufficient, matching street perspectives from one drawing with building facades from another, aligning the recurring architectural landmarks like the distinctive clock tower and the circular public garden that appeared in multiple renderings from different vantage points, and gradually assembling what he would later describe as a master map of a city that has never existed, drawn with the precision of a surveyor who has walked every street and documented every structure. The completed arrangement, which Blackwood photographed on November 16th with multiple exposures to capture the full scope of his assembled map, revealed not the random imaginative productions of a child's mind, but a coherent, comprehensive urban plan demonstrating sophisticated principles of city organization that included a clearly defined central business district with tall commercial buildings clustered around a central plaza dominated by the clock tower, radiating outward into distinct residential neighborhoods showing progressive density gradation from dense urban housing to more spacious suburban development, separated from these residential zones by carefully planned industrial districts positioned strategically near the railway infrastructure to facilitate goods transport, interspersed throughout with public spaces including parks, gardens, and civic buildings positioned according to principles of urban planning that Blackwood recognized as far more advanced than the often haphazard development characterizing even Britain's major cities in 1883. What disturbed him most profoundly, documented extensively in his journal entries from November 16th through November 20th, was the incorporation of planning principles that demonstrated understanding of concepts that would not be formalized until the 20th century urban planning movement, Catherine's imaginary city showing evidence of systematic zoning separating incompatible land uses, traffic flow management through street width variations and intersection designs suggesting accommodation for vehicular traffic far exceeding horse-drawn carriage requirements, sanitation planning evident in the careful positioning of what appeared to be water treatment facilities and waste management infrastructure, and even suggestions of public transportation networks, including not merely the railway stations she had drawn in detail, but what appeared to be stations for some form of internal city transit system following regular intervals along major thoroughfares, in a pattern that would not be implemented in British cities until the development of electric tram and underground railway systems decades in the future. Blackwood's journal entry from the evening of November 15th, 1883, preserved in Cambridge University archives and quoted extensively in subsequent academic analyses of the case, conveys the intellectual vertigo of a trained scholar confronting evidence that fundamentally challenged his understanding of what should be possible. Writing in handwriting that shows visible agitation compared to his normally precise script, that I find myself standing before the blueprints of a city that has never been built, perhaps never meant to be built in our time, a complete urban environment designed with sophistication that surpasses our greatest modern cities, emerging from the mind or the hand or whatever mechanism drives an 8-year-old girl who should not possess knowledge of architectural principles I myself barely comprehend, and I confess I no longer know whether I am documenting a medical curiosity or confronting evidence of something that has no place in rational scientific understanding. The systematic verification effort began on November 21st, 1883, when Professor Blackwood and Dr. Bow Hartford initiated what their correspondents would later describe as the geographical search, a methodical investigation designed to determine whether Catherine Ashworth might somehow be drawing a real location she had encountered through means they had not yet identified. The first step requiring confirmation of the child's travel history, which Hartford obtained through extensive interviews with her parents, her schoolteacher, Miss Hartwell, and neighbours who had known the family throughout Catherine's entire life, all sources unanimously confirming that the girl had never travelled beyond a 15-mile radius of Thornfield, her furthest journey being an excursion to Winchester in 1881, when she was 6 years old, a trip documented in her father's diary and confirmed by the aunt they had visited. Certainly insufficient exposure to explain the sophisticated urban architecture filling her drawings. Blackwood's investigation strategy, documented in his methodical notebook entries preserved at Cambridge, involved systematic comparison of Catherine's drawings with architectural surveys and photographic documentation of major British cities, beginning with London, where he spent 4 days from November 23rd through November 26th, consulting with the Royal Institute of British Architects' comprehensive archives of London building surveys, comparing Catherine's distinctive clock tower, her circular public garden, her railway station designs, and her commercial building facades against documented London architecture spanning 2 centuries of development. Finding numerous superficial similarities but no comprehensive matches to the interconnected urban landscape she had drawn, individual elements occasionally resembling London structures, but never in the configurations or relationships Catherine had depicted, the overall urban plan showing none of London's historical development patterns or geographical constraints. The search expanded to Manchester, Birmingham, and Edinburgh through December 1883, Blackwood travelling personally to Manchester on December 1st and maintaining extensive correspondence with architectural colleagues in Birmingham and Edinburgh who examined photographic reproductions of Catherine's drawings against their city's documented architecture, each investigation yielding the same frustrating result of occasional resemblances to individual buildings or architectural features, but no systematic correspondence to any real urban environment, Birmingham's industrial development sharing some organizational principles with Catherine's industrial districts, but differing fundamentally in layout and specific structures, Manchester's Victorian commercial architecture echoing some stylistic elements visible in her drawings, but arranged in completely different urban patterns, Edinburgh's distinctive topography and architectural heritage bearing no relationship whatsoever to the flat, systematically planned city emerging from the girl's pencil. What disturbed Blackwood increasingly, documented in his letters to Cambridge colleague Professor Charles Ashford, was not merely the absence of matches, but the growing realization that Catherine's city was too coherent to be amalgamated from various sources, too systematically planned to represent confused memories of different locations, demonstrating instead the unified vision of a single urban environment that existed nowhere in Britain, despite incorporating architectural styles and urban planning principles that were distinctly British in character, suggesting she was drawing not a foreign city, but rather a British city that had never been built, or perhaps more disturbingly, had not yet been built. Blackwood's investigation extended beyond Britain in late December 1883 through correspondence with architectural scholars in Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and New York, sending photographic reproductions of selected drawings with detailed queries about possible matches to European or American urban development, receiving responses throughout January 1884 that uniformly reported no comprehensive correspondences, despite occasional similarities to Haussmann's Paris boulevards or New York's emerging grid patterns, none sufficient to explain the complete urban environment Catherine had documented. The conclusion became inescapable by early January 1884, documented in Blackwood's journal entry dated January 8th, stating with barely contained agitation that "We have exhausted all rational possibilities for geographical correspondence. The city exists nowhere in the civilized world, despite our systematic search across 2 continents, leaving us confronting the impossible alternative that Catherine draws not from memory or observation, but from some other source entirely." A conclusion that led him to articulate for the first time in writing the possibility he had been avoiding, adding in a passage he would later attempt to strike through, but which remains legible in the preserved manuscript, that if we accept the technical sophistication suggesting these buildings could exist, indeed will exist, given their practical engineering, but acknowledge they exist nowhere presently, are we not confronting the possibility that we witness not memory, but prophecy? Not observation of what is, but vision of what will be, a suggestion he immediately qualified as unscientific speculation unsuitable for serious consideration, yet which he found himself unable to completely abandon as the only framework that accommodated all the evidence accumulating in the Hertford dining room, where Catherine's drawings mapped a city that had never existed anywhere, except, perhaps, in a future that an 8-year-old girl in rural Hampshire had somehow accessed through means that challenged everything rational inquiry demanded he believe about the nature of time, consciousness, and the boundaries of human perception. The crucial discovery occurred on December 3rd, 1883, documented in Dr. Hartford's daily case notes as taking place at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, when he was conducting his routine examination of Catherine's accumulated drawings in the Hertford residence dining room that had become the de facto archive for her increasingly disturbing architectural productions. Hartford engaged in the methodical process he had maintained throughout the investigation of cataloguing each piece with detailed notes about technical features and recurring elements, when his attention was drawn to what appeared at first glance to be a smudge or imperfection at the bottom margin of drawing number 143. A detailed rendering of what appeared to be a public library building with elaborate Victorian Gothic facades and precise window measurements, the apparent imperfection catching afternoon sunlight at an angle that revealed it to be not random marking, but intentional text, rendered in letters so small they were nearly invisible to unaided observation. Hertford immediately summoned Professor Blackwood from his lodgings at the village inn, and the 2 men spent the next hour examining the drawing under magnifying equipment that Blackwood had brought from Cambridge for studying architectural details, the magnification revealing tiny, meticulously formed writing in Catherine's distinctive hand running along the bottom edge of the drawing in letters barely 2 millimeters high. Text that proclaimed in careful script, "Central Library dedicated November 1902, designed by Harrison and Sons Architects, erected on Charter Street." A discovery that sent both men into immediate systematic re-examination of every drawing in the collection, using the magnifying equipment to search for similar inscriptions they had missed during previous analyses that had focused on architectural elements rather than marginal annotations. What they discovered over the following 3 days of intensive examination, documented in Blackwood's journal entries from December 3rd through December 6th, with handwriting showing visible agitation and multiple instances of ink blots suggesting trembling hands, was that approximately 60% of Catherine's drawings contained these microscopic inscriptions, each providing specific information that transformed the drawings from anonymous architectural studies into labeled, dated documentation of specific buildings with specific purposes erected on specific dates, dates that ranged from 1891 to 1923, fully 40 years into a future that Catherine would not live to see even if she survived to old age. The inscriptions included street names like Charter Street, Wellington Avenue, and Victoria Embankment, building designations like St. Thomas Hospital opened April 1897, and Grand Railway Terminal completed March 1908, and most disturbingly, dedication plaques crediting specific architects and architectural firms, some of whom were established professionals in 1883, but attributed to buildings they had not yet designed, and in some cases to architectural styles they had not yet worked in, while others bore names that meant nothing to Blackwood's extensive knowledge of British architectural practitioners, suggesting either fictional attributions or architects who had not yet established their practices or perhaps had not yet been born. Blackwood's response, documented in actions that demonstrate the profound impact of this discovery on a man trained in rigorous academic methodology, was to immediately arrange a meeting with his solicitor in Winchester on December 8, 1883, bringing with him detailed photographs of 12 drawings showing clear inscriptions, comprehensive written documentation of all discovered text, including precise transcriptions and translations of architectural terminology, and a sealed letter addressed to the master of his Cambridge college, the entire collection to be deposited with the solicitor under instructions that it be held sealed until 1925 or until such time as any of the specific predictions could be verified, whichever came first, Blackwood's cover letter stating in language preserved in the solicitor's archives that, if even one of these elements manifests as she has drawn it, if even a single building is erected on the street she has named by the architect she has credited in the year she has specified, we are confronting something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of time and consciousness. And I wish there to be indisputable evidence that these predictions existed in documented form decades before any possible fulfillment, lest future scholars dismiss what we have witnessed as retrospective fabrication or wishful interpretation of ambiguous drawings. Catherine Ashworth's physical deterioration accelerated dramatically throughout December 1883, documented with clinical precision in Dr. Hartford's daily medical observations that chart a progressive decline alarming in its rapidity and disturbing in its particulars. The physician's case notes from December 1st recording Catherine's weight as approximately 52 pounds, a loss of nearly 8 pounds from her September baseline, that represented a dangerous percentage of her small frame. Her appearance described as markedly gaunt, with pronounced hollowing of cheeks and visible skeletal structure beneath increasingly translucent skin, accompanied by fever episodes occurring every 2 to 3 days, with temperatures reaching 101 degrees Fahrenheit, that would spike suddenly in late afternoon and break just as mysteriously by morning, leaving her drenched in perspiration and further weakened. Hartford's documentation noted the disturbing pattern of her consciousness, no longer showing clear delineation between her trance-like drawing states and normal awareness, but instead manifesting what he termed graduated dissociation, where she would drift between states throughout the day, sometimes responding to her mother's voice with apparent recognition, other times staring through family members as if they were transparent obstacles blocking her view of something visible only to her, the moments of genuine lucidity becoming increasingly rare and brief as December progressed, islands of the child she had been surrounded by growing expanses of absence where something else seemed to occupy her form. The drawing behavior itself underwent disturbing evolution, no longer confined to supervised sessions or even to her waking hours, but manifesting at all times, Catherine's hands moving in constant sketching motions, even without materials, her fingers tracing architectural details on empty air on bed sheets, on her own arms. Dr. Bunn, Hartford, documenting on December 7th, an incident where he observed her apparently asleep, yet producing a detailed floor plan, with her eyes closed and no visible awareness of her actions. The resulting drawing showing the same technical precision as her conscious work, perhaps even greater mechanical exactitude, as if the removal of her waking awareness eliminated some final resistance to whatever force guided her hand. What disturbed Hartford and Professor Blackwood even more profoundly was the change in her subject matter beginning in mid-December, her drawings shifting from exterior architectural views and urban planning layouts to interior scenes showing the private spaces within buildings that existed nowhere, detailed renderings of drawing rooms with specific furniture arrangements, bedrooms with personal items visible on dressers, studies with books on shelves rendered clearly enough that titles could be read under magnification, kitchens showing the placement of cooking implements and decorative china, domestic interiors she could not possibly have entered because the buildings themselves did not exist, yet depicted with the casual familiarity of intimate knowledge, as if she had lived within these impossible rooms and was documenting them from memory. The most unsettling development came on December 12th when Catherine began drawing people, not architectural subjects but human portraits, detailed facial studies showing individuals of various ages with names and dates written beneath in her microscopic script: Thomas Waverley, 1843 to 1919, beneath the portrait of a stern gentleman with impressive moustache; Elizabeth Crenshaw, 1871 to 1941, beneath a young woman's face; James Hartford, Jr., 1884 to 1956, beneath an infant's careful rendering, the last name sending a shock through Dr. Hartford, who was unmarried and childless, staring at this portrait of a baby attributed with his surname and a birth year that lay only months in the future. Some portraits appeared multiple times across different drawings, showing the same individuals at different ages, a boy of perhaps 8 in one drawing appearing as a young man of 20 in another, and as a middle-aged gentleman of 45 in a third, all clearly the same person, despite the decades separating the depictions, all labelled with the same name and dates, spanning lifetimes Catherine was depicting in their entirety, from youth to age. William and Margaret Ashworth's desperation grew in proportion to their daughter's decline. Margaret's December 15th letter to her sister, describing sleepless nights listening to Catherine's breathing, terrified that each exhalation might be the last, watching her daughter slip away into a country from which I fear she may never return to us. The parents consulting with Hartford daily about possible interventions, while understanding with growing hopelessness that conventional medicine had no framework for addressing whatever consumed their child. Their final desperate measure came on December 18th, when they summoned Father Benedict from the parish church, an elderly priest who had served Thornfield for 40 years and was known for his compassionate counsel, asking him to pray over Catherine and perhaps perform whatever spiritual intervention might break the hold of what they had come to view as something beyond medical explanation. The priest arriving that afternoon and spending 30 minutes alone with Catherine in her room, while her parents and Dr. Hartford waited anxiously downstairs, emerging pale and visibly shaken, refusing to discuss what had occurred except to tell the parents with profound gravity that their daughter was touched by something beyond my capacity to address. Departing quickly, and leaving a notation in the parish records dated December 18th, 1883, that referenced only a matter of extreme spiritual disturbance in a child of the parish, nature uncertain, requiring prayer but not intervention. The priest refusing all subsequent requests to return to the Ashworth home, despite Margaret's pleading letters, his final response stating simply that some mysteries are not meant for pastoral resolution, and I fear your daughter stands at the threshold of one such mystery where my presence serves no purpose, and may indeed constitute interference in matters beyond the Church's proper domain. The final supervised drawing session took place on December 23, 1883, in the Ashworth farmhouse parlour, a gathering documented in multiple independent accounts that provide convergent testimony to the extraordinary events of that evening. The participants assembling at 7 o'clock, including Dr. James Hartford with his medical equipment and observation notebooks, Professor Edmund Blackwood carrying his photographic apparatus and measurement instruments, Miss Eleanor Hartwell, who had witnessed the phenomenon from its August inception, and William and Margaret Ashworth, whose presence was both as parents and as legal guardians, providing consent for what all understood might be Catherine's final drawing session given her precipitous physical decline. Catherine's appearance on that winter evening shocked even those who had monitored her deterioration daily, the child weighing approximately 47 pounds according to Hartford's pre-session measurement, her frame so emaciated that bone structure was clearly visible beneath skin that had taken on an almost translucent quality, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets, yet possessing a peculiar brightness that Hartford described as feverish illumination, suggesting consciousness burning at intensity far beyond sustainable limits. Her hands never still but moving constantly in the air, tracing invisible architectural details, even as her mother helped her into the chair prepared at the drawing table, fingers sketching phantom buildings that only she could perceive. The decision to permit this final session came after lengthy discussion among the adults, Margaret Ashworth initially refusing to allow what she feared might literally kill her daughter, arguing that they should simply keep Catherine comfortable and pray for natural recovery, but Hartford presenting the medical reality that Catherine's condition was deteriorating, regardless of whether she drew or not, that whatever process consumed her would continue with or without their observation, and that permitting this final documentation might provide understanding that could help future physicians confronting similar impossible phenomena, Blackwood adding with academic gravity that they were witnessing something unprecedented in recorded medical and psychological history, that their duty to knowledge and to posterity required complete documentation, however painful the process might be to those who loved the child. The session began at 7:45, when Hartford placed before Catherine a sheet of paper, unlike any she had previously used, a single piece of expensive architectural vellum, measuring 36 inches by 24 inches, that Blackwood had procured from London specifically for this purpose, providing her with a complete set of professional drafting implements, including mechanical pencils of varying weights, precision rulers, compasses, and a full palette of drawing inks, the child's hands moving toward the materials with immediate purposefulness even before Hartford had finished arranging them, her right hand selecting a fine-point pencil with the automatic certainty of long professional practice, her posture shifting into the rigid vertical alignment that characterized her trance states as her eyes fixed on the blank vellum with an intensity that suggested she was not seeing emptiness, but rather copying from some invisible template suspended before her. What followed across the next 3 hours and 17 minutes, timed precisely by Hartford's pocket watch and documented in his minute-by-minute case notes, was a drawing performance of such sustained intensity and technical virtuosity that all observers found themselves simultaneously fascinated and disturbed, Catherine's hand moving across the vellum in continuous fluid motion, with virtually no pauses for consideration or correction, beginning at the top left corner and working systematically across and down the sheet in a manner suggesting not artistic creation, but mechanical reproduction, as if she were tracing over lines already present, though invisible to normal sight, her breathing shallow and rapid, her body temperature elevated to the point that perspiration soaked through her nightgown within the first hour, though she showed no awareness of physical discomfort or indeed of anything except the work flowing from her hands onto the vellum before her. The drawing that emerged under the observers' increasingly awed and unsettled gazes was a panoramic city view from an elevated perspective, as if rendered from a height of perhaps 500 feet, looking down and across an urban landscape of stunning complexity and coherent detail, showing not merely individual buildings, but an entire interconnected cityscape spanning what Blackwood estimated as approximately 3 square miles of developed urban environment, with hundreds of structures rendered in sufficient detail that architectural styles could be identified. Streets laid out in logical grid patterns, modified by the suggestions of natural topography. Public squares and parks, positioned at intervals, suggesting sophisticated urban planning principles. Even the indication of bridges spanning what appeared to be a river or canal cutting through the eastern portion of the city. The entire composition possessing a unity and completeness that conveyed not imaginative fantasy, but documentary representation of an actual place that existed somewhere, somehow, in some version of reality, inaccessible to the observers, but evidently visible with perfect clarity to the child whose hand recorded it with such meticulous precision. The specific elements visible in the panoramic view included the recurring features from Catherine's previous drawings, now positioned in their proper relationships within the complete urban landscape. The distinctive clock tower rising from what appeared to be a civic centre, the circular public garden with its elaborate fountain system positioned in a northern district, the Gothic railway terminal that had appeared in drawing number 47, now visible as part of a larger transportation infrastructure, residential neighbourhoods showing the characteristic architecture Catherine had detailed in earlier works, industrial buildings concentrated in a western zone near what appeared to be a waterfront or loading area, even the suggestion of human activity through the indication of vehicles on streets and the positioning of what might be market stalls or street furniture, the vehicles themselves rendered with enough detail to show that they were unlike any contemporary conveyances, appearing more streamlined and mechanically sophisticated than the horse-drawn carriages of 1883, suggesting perhaps the motorized vehicles that existed in 1883 only as experimental curiosities, but which Catherine depicted as commonplace elements of her impossible city's transportation system. Hertford's medical observations documented Catherine's progressive dissociation from her surroundings as the session continued, noting at the 90-minute mark that she had entered a state resembling catatonia, with eyes open, but showing no pupillary response to changes in light when he passed his hand before her face, no reaction to verbal address, even when her mother spoke her name directly into her ear, no acknowledgement of physical touch when Margaret gently stroked her daughter's arm. The child's consciousness seemingly evacuated entirely from her physical form, leaving behind only the mechanical drawing function that continued with undiminished precision and intensity. Hertford writing in his notes that Catherine's condition suggested complete dissociation of consciousness from corporeal housing, the body functioning as mere instrument for forces or intelligence, utilizing her form as a medium through which to render visible that which exists in dimensions or times beyond our current perception, her hands moving with mechanical precision, suggesting external guidance rather than internal artistic impulse. The completion of the panoramic drawing occurred at precisely 11:47 p.m. on December 23, 1883, documented by Dr. Beau Hertford's pocket watch, that he consulted immediately upon witnessing Catherine Ashworth's pencil lift from the vellum after 3 hours and 17 minutes of continuous work. The child's hand hovering motionless above the finished cityscape for perhaps 3 seconds before her entire body went rigid with a violent muscular contraction that Hertford's medical notes described as instantaneous transition from fluid drawing motion to complete tetanic spasm affecting all voluntary musculature, her back arching against the chair with such force that the wooden furniture creaked audibly, her eyes rolling back until only the whites were visible, her mouth opening in what appeared to be an attempt at speech or perhaps a scream, though no sound emerged. Then a collapse so sudden and complete that William Ashworth barely caught his daughter's falling body as she pitched forward from the chair, Hertford immediately checking for vital signs, and finding to his profound horror that Catherine had stopped breathing entirely, no respiratory movement visible, no pulse detectable at wrist or throat, the child's skin taking on the greyish pallor of oxygen deprivation, while her mother's anguished cries filled the parlour, and Professor Blackwood stood frozen with his hands raised, as if to help, but uncertain what action could possibly be taken in the face of what appeared to be death itself, claiming the small form in her father's arms. Hartford's medical training overrode his shock within seconds. The physician positioning Catherine on the floor and attempting the respiratory resuscitation techniques of the period, pressing rhythmically on her chest, while Margaret Ashworth knelt beside her daughter, sobbing prayers, and Miss Hartwell stood white-faced against the wall, the seconds stretching with agonizing slowness, while Hartford counted under his breath, his case notes later recording with clinical precision that 47 seconds elapsed from cessation of breathing to the sudden, violent gasp that signaled Catherine's return to life, her lungs filling with a sound like tearing fabric, her back arching again as oxygen flooded her system, her eyes snapping open with pupils dilated to the point that virtually no iris color remained visible, focused on nothing, or perhaps on something invisible to the adults surrounding her. And then the seizure began in earnest, her small body convulsing with terrifying force, limbs thrashing with strength that required both her father and Hartford to restrain her, lest she injure herself against the furniture, her head snapping from side to side, foam appearing at the corners of her mouth. The violent episode lasting exactly 3 minutes, according to Hartford's careful timing, before subsiding gradually into trembling stillness. Catherine's eyes closing, her breathing becoming regular and shallow, her body relaxing into what appeared to be natural sleep, while the adults remained kneeling around her, hardly daring to move or speak, wondering if the child they had known still existed within the form that had just returned from whatever impossible place it had been. What Hartford discovered upon examining Catherine when she woke naturally 4 hours later, in the early morning of December 24th, was perhaps the most disturbing development of all, the child opening her eyes with clear recognition of her parents, speaking their names with obvious affection and confusion about why she was sleeping on the parlor floor, asking what day it was, and expressing surprise that Christmas was so near. The last date she remembered being August, when school had just begun. Her confusion deepening into visible distress when her mother showed her the drawings spread across every surface of the room. Catherine insisting with genuine bewilderment that she couldn't draw, had never been able to draw beyond the simple sketches any child might make. Staring at the panoramic cityscape she had completed only hours earlier, with no recognition whatsoever, examining the technical architectural details with the incomprehension of someone confronting an utterly foreign skill, turning to Hartford with tears in her eyes, asking why they were showing her these pictures, and pretending she had made them when she knew she couldn't possibly have done so. Hartford's neurological examination conducted over the following 3 days found no evidence of physical brain damage. Catherine's reflexes normal, her cognitive functions age-appropriate, her memory intact for events prior to August, but completely blank regarding the entire 4-month period of the drawing phenomenon. A case of dissociative amnesia so complete that Hartford described it in his case notes as a consciousness restored to its original configuration, as if the previous months had been experienced by another inhabitant of her form, a temporary tenant who has now departed, leaving the rightful owner returned to her dwelling with no knowledge of what transpired during her absence. The child who sits before me now, the same Catherine who existed prior to August, yet entirely disconnected from the entity who produced works of such impossible sophistication and prophetic precision. Catherine Ashworth's recovery throughout 1884 progressed with the steady normalcy that made the preceding 4 months seem increasingly like some collective delusion experienced by all who had witnessed her impossible feat. The child returning to the ordinary rhythms of rural childhood, with no residual effects beyond a persistent thinness that gradually filled out as her appetite returned, and her mother's determined feeding restored healthy weight to her small frame. Her development proceeding along trajectories entirely typical for a girl of her age and circumstances. Attending the village school where Miss Eleanor Hartwell watched her with a mixture of relief and persistent unease. Observing that Catherine showed no artistic ability whatsoever beyond the crude sketches any 9-year-old might produce. Her drawings of houses and trees and animals possessing the charming incompetence of childhood art, utterly devoid of the technical sophistication that had characterized her trance-state productions. The child herself maintaining complete amnesia regarding the entire episode, and growing visibly distressed on the few occasions when adults attempted to discuss the drawings with her, insisting with tears and evident confusion that she didn't understand why people kept showing her pictures and claiming she had made them when she knew she couldn't draw like that. Her parents eventually requesting that all mention of the phenomenon cease in her presence, that their daughter be permitted to live as the normal child she had become, a request that Dr. Hartford and Professor Blackwood honored, though both men continued their separate documentation and analysis of the case that had so profoundly disturbed their understanding of human consciousness and the nature of time itself. The scholarly attention paid to Catherine's case throughout the 1880s manifested primarily in medical and psychological journals, where Hartford published a comprehensive account in 1885 titled Dissociative Artistic Phenomena in a Juvenile Subject, a case study in temporary acquisition of impossible skills. His article careful to document every aspect of the phenomenon while acknowledging his complete inability to explain the mechanism by which an untrained child had produced architectural drawings of professional quality depicting structures and urban planning principles that existed nowhere in the contemporary world. The publication generating significant response from physicians and alienists across Britain and Europe, some proposing theories of unconscious fraud or collective delusion, others suggesting neurological explanations involving savant capabilities temporarily manifesting then subsiding, still others venturing into territory Hartford himself found uncomfortably unscientific by proposing that Catherine had somehow accessed knowledge from future times or alternate realities, the debate remaining largely theoretical and speculative given the unprecedented nature of the case and the lack of any comparable documented phenomena that might provide context for understanding what had occurred in that Hampshire farmhouse between August and December 1883. Professor Edmund Blackwood devoted considerable resources to the preservation and continued analysis of Catherine's drawings, creating a comprehensive catalogue system that numbered and cross-referenced all 237 individual pieces she had produced, photographing each drawing using the most advanced photographic equipment available, creating precise measurements of every architectural element, attempting to identify the urban planning principles and construction methodologies represented in her impossible city, his own academic reputation suffering somewhat as colleagues at Cambridge and other universities grew increasingly skeptical of his claims regarding the drawing's sophistication and prophetic nature, some suggesting that Blackwood himself had perhaps been deceived by an elaborate hoax perpetrated by adults using the child as unwitting instrument, others proposing that his interpretation of the drawing's technical accuracy was influenced by his desire to believe he had witnessed something extraordinary, rather than by objective analysis of what were, after all, merely the productions of a disturbed child during an episode of psychological illness. The academic skepticism that emerged throughout the late 1880s might have relegated Catherine's case to the status of curious medical footnote, interesting primarily to specialists in dissociative disorders and childhood psychological phenomena, except for what occurred in 1891, when construction began on a new railway terminal in Birmingham, a project designed by the prominent architectural firm of Morrison and Associates, the structure's plans incorporating a distinctive series of Gothic arches supporting the main platform shed, the specific configuration of pointed arches with ornamental ironwork spanning precisely 47 feet between support columns, a design that struck Professor Blackwood with the force of revelation when he travelled to Birmingham in May 1891 and stood before the rising structure, then returned to his Cambridge study to extract from his carefully preserved collection drawing number 47, dated October 12, 1883, a detailed architectural rendering showing exactly the arch configuration now being constructed in Birmingham, including not merely the general Gothic style, but the specific proportions, the precise span measurements, the particular ornamental details of the ironwork, Even the platform layout beneath the arches, matching what Catherine had drawn 8 years before the Birmingham terminal was designed. The correspondence so exact that Blackwood's hands trembled as he drafted urgent letters to colleagues who had previously dismissed his claims. His correspondence describing his experience as standing before the physical manifestation of what an 8-year-old girl drew in 1883, witnessing the impossible transition from her penciled vision to constructed reality, confronting evidence that fundamentally challenges every assumption about the linear nature of time and the boundaries of human consciousness. The Birmingham Railway Terminal verification in 1891 proved to be merely the beginning of a cascade of impossible correspondences that would unfold over the following 3 decades, transforming Professor Edmund Blackwood's academic inquiry from curious investigation into obsessive documentation of what he increasingly believed represented evidence of genuine precognition. His meticulous records tracking each manifestation of Catherine Ashworth's 1883 drawings into physical reality across Britain, the next verification occurring in 1896 when construction completed on St Mary's Hospital in London's East End, a charitable institution designed by architectural firm Henderson and Sons. The building's distinctive cruciform layout and particular arrangement of ward pavilions matching drawing number 83 from Catherine's collection with such precision that Blackwood's measurement comparisons found correspondence within inches. The hospital's central administrative building, featuring the exact fenestration pattern, the specific placement of Gothic revival elements, even the ornamental ironwork above the main entrance replicating details an 8-year-old girl had rendered 13 years before the structure was designed. Blackwood's correspondence with the Henderson firm establishing that their design process had begun in 1894 with no knowledge of Catherine's drawings and no conscious reference to her prophetic architectural vision, the architects themselves expressing polite skepticism when Blackwood presented his evidence, though their chief draftsman privately admitted the correspondence was unsettling beyond rational explanation. The Manchester Public Library verification in 1902 provided perhaps the most extensively documented correspondence, the structure's completion, matching Catherine's drawing number 104, dated October 29, 1883. Her rendering having depicted with extraordinary precision the library's distinctive reading room, with its circular arrangement of study tables radiating from a central reference desk, the specific configuration of clerestory windows providing natural illumination, the ornamental plasterwork of the ceiling featuring geometric patterns she had detailed with mathematical accuracy, the building's architect Roger Pemberton, nephew of the same Thomas Pemberton, who had first examined Catherine's drawings 2 decades earlier, reviewing Blackwood's evidence and publishing a remarkably candid statement in the Journal of the Royal Institute of British Architects, acknowledging that the correspondence between Miss Ashworth's 1883 drawing and my completed structure defies explanation through coincidence or unconscious influence, representing either the most extraordinary case of prophetic vision in documented history or evidence of principles governing time and consciousness that our current scientific framework cannot accommodate. His professional courage in making such statement unusual for the period and lending considerable credibility to Blackwood's increasingly comprehensive documentation. Blackwood's major publication appeared in 1912, a substantial monograph titled The Thornfield Drawings, a Study in Impossible Precognition, running to over 300 pages with photographic reproductions of Catherine's original drawings, alongside photographs of the realized structures, detailed architectural comparisons demonstrating the precise correspondences, extensive discussion of the implications for understanding consciousness and temporal causality. The work representing his life's scholarly focus and consuming the majority of his professional attention for over 2 decades. The academic reception proving predictably mixed, with mainstream scholars maintaining skeptical positions suggesting elaborate fraud, selective interpretation of ambiguous or statistical inevitability, given enough architectural drawings Eventually, some would coincidentally match later structures, while a minority of researchers, primarily from fields of psychology and emerging parapsychology, embraced Blackwood's work as evidence demanding serious investigation of precognitive phenomena and challenging materialist assumptions about the fixed nature of time and the boundaries of human consciousness. The most disturbing verification occurred in 1918, when a war memorial was erected in Kensington Gardens, London, dedicated to casualties of the Great War that had devastated Europe and claimed a generation of British young men. The memorial's design, featuring a central bronze sculpture of a grieving mother surrounded by panels listing the names of the dead, the structure's specific configuration matching drawing number 172 from Catherine's collection, dated December 19, 1883. Her rendering having shown not merely the general memorial design, but precise sculptural details, the particular arrangement of the commemorative panels, even the landscaping of the surrounding garden space. But what elevated this correspondence from merely unsettling to profoundly disturbing was Catherine's annotation at the drawing's base, where she had written in her careful child's hand, "Memorial to the Fallen, dedicated 1918, sculptor J. Morrison and R. Blackwell," names that in 1883 belonged to two boys aged 7 and 5 respectively, children who would grow to become the sculptors selected by Memorial Committee in 1917 to create the Kensington Gardens monument, their selection and collaborative work unknown and unplannable when Catherine drew their names 34 years before the memorial's dedication, suggesting her prophetic vision extended not merely to architectural forms, but to the future lives and professional collaborations of individuals who were children when she recorded their eventual accomplishment. By 1923, the final date inscribed on any of Catherine's drawings, Blackwood had documented 37 verified correspondences between her 1883 architectural visions and realized structures across Britain, his comprehensive file including detailed measurements, photographic evidence, architect testimonies, and temporal documentation, establishing that Catherine's drawings consistently preceded the design and construction of matching structures by periods ranging from 8 to 40 years, the statistical improbability of such correspondences occurring through chance accumulating to levels that even skeptical scholars found increasingly difficult to dismiss through appeals to coincidence or fraud, particularly given the continued existence of Catherine herself living her unremarkable life in Hampshire, with no memory of her childhood phenomenon and no apparent awareness that buildings continued to manifest across Britain, matching the impossible visions that had flowed through her small hands during those 4 months in 1883, when something beyond ordinary consciousness had used an 8-year-old girl as instrument for recording a future that had not yet come to pass. Catherine Ashworth died on March 17, 1954, at the age of 79 in the same Hampshire village where she had been born. Her passing noted only in local records as the death of Margaret Catherine Henley, having married Albert Henley, a local tradesman, in 1897, and lived an entirely unremarkable life as farm wife and mother of 4 children, her existence distinguished by no particular accomplishments or notable events beyond that strange 4-month period in 1883, when something impossible had manifested through her small hands, the woman herself maintaining throughout her life complete amnesia regarding those months, and expressing only puzzled discomfort on the rare occasions when researchers approached her about the drawings, insisting she had never possessed artistic ability and didn't understand why people persisted in showing her elaborate architectural renderings and claiming she had created them as a child, her family protecting her from what they viewed as unwanted intrusion and occasionally distressing attention. Though her eldest son Thomas Henley preserved among family papers his mother's handwritten statement from 1931 declaring, "I have been shown drawings which people say I made when I was 8 years old, but I have no memory of making them, and cannot believe I could have done such work, as I have never been able to draw anything beyond simple sketches. Whatever happened in 1883 has left no trace in my memory, and I would prefer to be left alone about this matter which has nothing to do with the life I have lived. The physical collection of Catherine's drawings survived with remarkable completeness through the dedicated preservation efforts of Professor Edmund Blackwood, who until his death in 1927 maintained careful custody of the 237 individual pieces she had produced. His estate bequeathing 187 drawings to Cambridge University's special collections, where they remain catalogued as the Thornfield Collection, housed in climate-controlled archives and available for scholarly examination by appointment, while 43 additional pieces were transferred to the British Museum's Department of Prints and Drawings in 1935 through donation by Blackwood's daughter, the remaining 7 drawings having been lost or destroyed over the decades, though. Photographic reproductions preserved by Blackwood documented their content for posterity. The physical artifacts themselves subjected to extensive analysis throughout the 20th century, including paper composition testing, ink analysis, handwriting examination, and forensic investigation, establishing beyond reasonable doubt their authentic creation by a child in 1883 rather than representing any form of later fabrication or fraud. Modern scholarly examination of the Thornfield collection has employed increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques while finding no satisfactory explanation for the phenomenon Catherine Ashworth represented, architectural historians confirming the technical sophistication of her drawings and the precise correspondence between numerous pieces and structures built decades after her prophetic renderings. Psychologists analyzing the case through frameworks of dissociative phenomena, savant capabilities, and altered states of consciousness without achieving explanatory consensus. Skeptical researchers proposing theories of elaborate hoax, selective interpretation of ambiguous correspondences, or statistical inevitability while struggling to account for the documented verified matches and the clear temporal sequence establishing Catherine's drawings preceded the structures they depicted by periods ranging from 8 to over 60 years. The academic literature on the case spanning psychology, architecture, history, and parapsychology, representing hundreds of papers and several book-length treatments, yet reaching no generally accepted explanation for how an 8-year-old girl with no training produced professional quality architectural drawings depicting buildings and urban features that would manifest decades into her future. The most unsettling aspect of Catherine's legacy remains the 23 drawings depicting buildings and urban features that as of this recording still have not been built or verified, structures rendered with the same technical precision and detailed annotation that characterized her verified prophetic works, including dates inscribed on the drawings ranging from 1947 through 2031. Some of these unverified pieces showing structures whose inscribed dates have already passed without apparent manifestation. Though researchers note that several verified correspondences weren't recognized for decades after the structures were built, suggesting some of the supposedly unverified drawings might match existing buildings not yet identified, while other pieces show dates still in the future, including drawing number 212 dated 2031, depicting what appears to be a transportation terminal of unusual design, incorporating architectural elements that don't correspond to any current building style. The existence of these unverified yet precisely rendered drawings maintaining the disturbing possibility that Catherine's prophetic vision extended far beyond the verified correspondences documented in Professor Blackwood's lifetime, that she recorded architectural futures spanning nearly 150 years from the moment of her impossible creation. Recent scholarly attention intensified following events in 2003 when construction completed on the Manchester-Arndale extension, a shopping complex incorporating a distinctive atrium design featuring a geometric glass ceiling and particular arrangement of interior levels. A local architectural historian visiting Cambridge's special collections and experiencing profound disturbance upon viewing drawing number 103, dated November 2nd, 1883, which depicted with disturbing precision the atrium configuration realized in Manchester 120 years later, including the specific geometry of the glass panels, the arrangement of escalators and walking levels, even the particular placement of structural support columns. The correspondence documented through detailed photographic comparison and architectural measurement, establishing yet another impossible verification of Catherine's prophetic architectural vision, this latest confirmation generating renewed media attention and academic interest in the case, researchers examining the remaining unverified drawings with heightened attention and unsettling speculation about what other structures might eventually manifest, matching the detailed renderings an 8-year-old girl produced during her 4-month episode of impossible consciousness in 1883. What Catherine Ashworth represents remains fundamentally unexplained despite over a century of scholarly investigation and analysis, her case standing as documented challenge to our understanding of consciousness, time, and the nature of human perception. The verified correspondences between her 1883 drawings and structures built decades later, defying explanation through conventional frameworks while demanding serious consideration of possibilities, our current scientific paradigm struggles to accommodate. The image of a small girl in rural Victorian England entering trance states and producing architectural plans for buildings that wouldn't exist until the 20th and 21st centuries, representing either the most elaborately sustained hoax in documented history, a case of precognitive ability that fundamentally challenges our understanding of temporal causality, or evidence of consciousness capabilities that transcend our conventional models of human mental function. The drawings themselves preserved in Cambridge and London, standing as physical artifacts that continue to disturb and perplex everyone who examines them and contemplates the impossible question of how they came to exist and what they ultimately represent about the nature of time and the boundaries of human awareness. If you're fascinated by documented historical mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality, cases where preserved evidence defies conventional explanation and demands we reconsider fundamental assumptions about consciousness and time, subscribe to this channel for more investigations into the strange, the unexplained, and the impossible events that occasionally surface in documented history, reminding us that our understanding of the world and human capabilities may be far more limited than we imagine.